Hi everyone, good day. I'm Anton Sevilla from Kyushu University, and today I'm going to give a prelude of our upcoming symposium in ACT Japan. We have a whole team, three of us from a clinical pedagogy research team in Kyushu University, and we're going to be talking about qualitative psychology and contextual behavioral science. So, for a little bit of background, connecting this to the actual practice of CBS. So, whether you're doing psychotherapy, counseling, coaching, or guidance, when you first meet the client, how do you make sense of what they're going through? How do you make sense of the difficulty that they're going through in a way that validates them, in a way that understands what they're going through? This is the process of case conceptualization. Also, when you, as you're going through the process of counseling, how do you, record and reflect on important movements, important, things that go well, things that go terribly, things that you could work on, things that you capitalize on, right? And third, during or at the end of counseling, how do you check the progress of your client to see if they're getting better, to see if they're facing things better? So when you look at these questions, I think these are very basic questions as if you try to be intelligent about your practice, being able to understand these things is very important. But one very common way that we approach this in ACBS is through quantitative research. So you have the AAQ, we have the MPFI, we have Compact, and you have these various questionnaires that let you measure various aspects of psychological flexibility, and they also connect to your ability to do generalizable nomothetic research. Um, but while we do make use of this, I think one of the things that I want to point out is that there's a human side to understanding. So, it may not be generalizable, but in a sense, this ideographic approach is already there in how you try to respond to this particular person in front of you, understanding what they're going through, understanding, you know, how things change and how they're affected by things. So this ideographic I thou understanding connects very closely to qualitative research. So let me read this out from an introductory book on the right. To qualitative research, qualitative researchers tend to be concerned with meaning. That is, they're interested in how people make sense of the world and how they experience events. They aim to understand what it is like to experience particular conditions and how people manage certain situations. So unlike quantitative research, it's not about understanding a population's generalizable features in a numeric way, but it's about exploring the particularity and variation of experience and its meaning. So what are different ways that people go through things? And I think many of you can already intuit how this connects a lot to our, the clinical wisdom as we speak of. So there are several main methodologies. If you look at the qualitative psychology textbook, grounded theory approach, phenomenological analysis, narrative analysis, discourse analysis, and in this talk, in this symposium as a whole, we'll be talking about the last three. Now, in CBS, there is actually a critique of qualitative research that I will talk about in my part of the symposium. But despite that, we still have qualitative research in JCBS. But perhaps because of that criticism, it does remain a minority. So I listed a few here, and if you look at these articles, what you see there, method-wise, they do content analysis, they do thematic analysis. In other words, not necessarily very philosophically sophisticated methods, with the exception of something I'm very fond of, functional self-discrimination measure. Anyway, so you do have this existing minority of qualitative research, and then actually Willard Day, who talked a lot about phenomenology, influenced Stephen Hayes' approach to language, and so you do have these connections to CBS. Also, with developments in RFT allowing us to analyze complex verbal behavior like narrative, so it's not just simple relational frames anymore. And then with this complex theory of the self, as you have with the work of Louis McHugh, um, then again you're getting a much more a possibility of a much more productive meeting between CBS and qualitative research. I especially like this special issue on narrative in perspectives of behavioral science. So with this background, gave a talk at AsiaFlex. That's the Asia SIG for ACBS on CBS qualitative research and self processes. And these are the main points I made. Qualitative research and CBS are prepared for a re-encounter, as I gave the background there. There are these connections despite the initial critique. And then number two, not just content analysis, but we can examine philosophically grounded methods like phenomenology, narrative analysis, and discourse analysis. And phenomenology can connect to self as process and tacting, narrative analysis to understand fusion and self as content, and discourse analysis with understanding the social context and pro-social factors that influence flexibility. So these are very interesting connections. And qualitative research can help us understand the quality of experience, and CBS can strengthen the functional approach and self as context. And so they can contribute to each other in that sense. So that's the background. That's where it's coming from. And this particular talk, it's going to be held in Japanese, in Tokyo at Waseda University, and there are going to be three presentations. So I'll talk about CBS narrative and functional descriptive contextualism. That will be in this video. And then the next two speakers, they're not part of this recording, but Hinoguchi Fumiya-san will be talking about phenomenology and grief, and Honda Teruhiko-san will be talking about autophenomenology and spirituality. But the basic conclusion that we're driving at here is that quantitative research, of course, is necessary for generalizability, but qualitative research can support that by understanding the particularity and variation of the quality of experience, by catching interactions outside of questionnaires, and by engaging clinical sensitivity and intuition while allowing these to be made into academically acceptable research papers. So that's the point we hope to make. And I'll get to my part of the presentation so you can have a look. So this is for my part of the presentation, CBS narrative and functional descriptive contextualism. This will be the outline of my talk. So I'll start with talking about more on the background of CBS and quali, and then look deep at narrative psychology and analysis in particular, and then CBS and this whole question of functional versus descriptive contextualism, and then last try to combine the two into a functional descriptive method. Okay, so just a very brief overview on my journey with CBS. So actually, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I am a clinical pedagogue. So I do philosophy of education. I do narrative psychology. I also do mindful education. So a lot of it has to do with applications in schools, not just as a counselor, but like school-wide transformation, thinking about the whole education process, not even just schools. And I learned primarily, maybe not very, common approach, but I learned through contextual schema therapy and clinical RFT. And so I think these two lent to connect with narrative. I'm also trained in narrative therapy, so I was affected by that as well. And I do have publications that connect to what we're talking about here. I have an article with JCBS, an act in the Kyoto School of Philosophy. If you want more of the, how the view of the human person sort of thing. And I also have an article on act and narrative practice. And that is very closely related to what I'm doing here. But here, I'm not doing the narrative practice side, but I'm doing more of the narrative analysis, the research side. Okay, so CBS and qualitative psych. There's a book on the right, Varieties of Scientific Contextualism, and the early dialogue. This book comes from Nevada Conference of the Varieties of Scientific Contextualism, which was in 1992, and this was actually a dialogue between the CBS camp and a lot of other non-CBS contextualists, so actually functional and descriptive contextualists, if you put it that way. And on the outside the ACBS camp, you had Theodore Sarbin, who is actually the founder of the narrative turn, and then you had Karl Scheibe, who's actually a Sarbin scholar. He also does dramaturgy. Goffman had Michael Doerr, who's an hermeneutist, and they all connect directly to the narrative tradition. So the narrative tradition from the start of the early days of ACBS has been connected to and in dialogue with ACBS. But as you see, they do find a lot of connections between a CBS and between CBS and narrative. So they did see that qualitative psychology is a form of contextualism. So it's not about mechanical causation, mere classification, and statistic treatment of forms or fixed patterns of development. So these are the more common things with quantitative psychology. So qualitative psychology tends to focus on particular experiences of acting in context. So in this non-reductive sense, so it's a contextualism in Pepper's classification. And so Sarbin says, for Pepper, the root metaphor for contextualism is the historical act. It is my intention to unpack the historical act and show that the subtext of the historical act is narrative. So there is this connection here between CBS and Quali. But unlike functional contextualism's focus on prediction and influence, Quali only aims at coherence. And so can it contribute to our work in CBS? And so let's start with a bit of an example, lightly looking at an example I put together from various students. And so when I meet my students and I ask them, so hey, what brings you here today? What's up? And usually what you get is a story. Not always, but usually what you get is a story about a problem. If you think about it in terms of antecedents, behavior, and consequences, you have the story of behavior, right? Of the beginning of the story, what comes before what you're trying to do, and then in the middle of the story, that's you trying to do something, and then it has particular consequences, and that's the end of the story. And you usually get a story like that. So one example story, a female MA student, I call her Junko-san. That's a pseudonym, of course. She works very hard, but does not get to do her own research. So her thesis is kind of stalled, and she ends up with this anxiety that she'll never become a researcher, that she's not creative enough, and that's the situation that she finds herself in. Now, usually they're not just going to say one story, so if you ask more about that, for instance, you get stories behind the antecedents, behind the what is the original situation. So in story 2, for instance, she tells me, like, she diligently does what her professors instruct, and she tends to feel a lot of pressure while doing tasks, though, and so she still feels uneasy despite completing tasks well. So that's another story. It links up, and then you can have also stories behind B. This whole trying to be a good student, So she was always a good student. She was always praised for doing things right, and even now she's still known to do tasks well. You can also have stories behind the consequence, and so basically, a lot of counseling, therapy, coaching is about listening to stories. Now, so on one hand, you have these stories about who the client is and what the client is going through. And then you also have stories of healing. So your journey with this client is in itself a story. So it starts with a problem story, but then it progresses, or you hope it progresses, toward a preferred story, from away moves toward moves, going through this choice point, hopefully with you, in therapy. And change happens by, so when you're stuck and repeating a particular problem behavior B, if you look at Tornecki, he says the change happens in that when you're able to change the context, you change the A, change the C, by either highlighting values or learning to open up to certain antecedents that you're not detecting. And in order to change the B, and if therapy is successful, you have a new story, ABC prime, that goes toward the client's values. So what you have here, so you have all these stories, and quantitative research will help you capture generalizable changes in psychological flexibility. So how psychological flexibility at the start, at the end. But it was all stories, and a lot of times you lose that story, and you lose all of this texture, particularity, and variation when you do the quantitative approach. Now that's trying to do its own thing, but we do see that the particularity and variation of experience is actually a very important part of clinical practice. So the reason why we do case studies, the reason why we do sharing, the reason why we watch videos is because it's not just about generalizable things, but it's also about understanding the particularity of experience. But then the funny thing is, how do you present this practicality, these stories of struggle and transformation as research? So it's almost like the only thing that gets to be the research is the numbers, and that's not really telling the whole story. So this is where I turn to narrative psychology, because narrative psychology has made it its primary business to focus on how to tell these stories. And narrative psychology is one of the most established methods of qualitative research. And it starts with Sarban, as I mentioned. It was with Hayes, dialoguing with Hayes, and back in the 90s. And so that was just like half a decade after he actually started the narrative psychology turn. So the narrative psychology turn started with him. Interestingly, if you look at the background, it really is a bit of a sibling of CBS. So CBS comes from the pragmatist philosopher William James. Now, William James had two buddies in this movement, John Dewey and George Herbert Mead. Now, John Dewey and George Herbert Mead really worked closely together, and narrative psychology will come from Mead and Cantor. I'm sure you've heard the name Cantor. So, this is very closely intellectually related traditions. And one of the things that they found is that basically narrative is experience near. Narrative is just very close to, that's how human beings naturally make sense of changing events. So there's this very famous study in 1944, how even when you have moving geometric objects, the way you remember that is by turning it into a story. And so you had this narrative turn in the 80s, which basically points out that the human being understands the world not through logical paradigmatic mode of thinking or a bunch of rules like a computer, which was what the cognitive turn was thinking about, but via the narrative mode, via stories. So in a sense, an important clinical question here, right, is when we look at a problem, sometimes we ask, what rule are you following there? Yeah. But isn't it closer to their experience to ask, hey, what story is coming up for you when you start to do your homework in that way, when you start to do your research in that way? It's not necessarily, the rule might take a while for them to get to. So for many cases, it might be closer to experience to look at the story. Okay, so what are the skills? So this is this is understanding through psychology of how people engage stories. And so when this developed into a mode of analysis, there are particular analytic tools that they have developed over time. So self-understanding is via stories, narrative identities. McAdams' book on the right, very big influence on me. But this is very, very close to the idea of self as content. So if you want the idea of self as content explained in one whole book, please have a look at the book at the right. But the whole idea, he actually developed not just a theory, but analytic methods. First of analyzing the structure of the stories, like when usually a client talks just a whole lot of stories, but seeing how are these actually separate stories, so separating multiple stories, but at the same time seeing how they connect, seeing how stories get articulated into other stories. Also separating plot from commentary. There's a part that's actually movement, and there's part that's someone voice over what's happening in the movie, so to speak. And then there are particular sequences like redemption and contamination sequence. You can actually count these sequences of how a positive situation turns terrible or a terrible situation gets redeemed. And you can look at these structural elements. You can also look at motive themes, like what is in this particular story, what is this person trying to value here? What is this person giving importance to? It can be a form of compliance, or it can be actually a form of personal values. And then also you look at personas and characters, like a story comes up, what kind of persona is it? The good student, the diligent student, the obedient person, and so you always come up with these characters, and you kind of see how they pull certain traits, certain aspects of self as content together. And then also these personas occur in a relational context, and so on and so forth. So basically you have all of these tools, clear analytic tools. Unlike Sarban's time, when it was all just a new idea, now they actually have tools of how you study and how you break apart narratives. And so if you look at Junko's story, I kind of mentioned some things. So you have her repeating a problem behavior, she's just obeying, she's studying in an uncritical way, she's over preparing, and these occur within particular antecedents, so, and you'll hear that in terms of stories, stories about receiving instructions, or stories about studying, or stories about teachers, and in those stories she tends to react in this particular way, and you start to see there a certain psychological flexibility traits, like fusion to particular stories, fusion to particular rules, and so on. And you also have certain consequences, so stories about her being seen as a good student, also worries, self-criticism about not being able to do research. So you see her tension, her inability to act here, as coming out in the consequences. So all of these are kind of tied together in this good student persona, this good student story. So it is possible to do research on something like this, so you could just to give an overview of what research in this field would look like. Usually the sample size is pretty small, 1 to 6. I've heard horror stories of editors asking for a sample size of 100 with narrative research. That's ridiculous. That's not how it works. That's not what it's trying to do. And you could look at, for instance, problem stories, like what kind of fusion and self-as content tend to be present in a particular population. Or you can look at the process, like how did the narrative identity or how did their self-as context shift over the course of therapy, and what was the result after therapy, right? And the process would be looking at the stories and then analyzing them first inductively. You look at the structure, you split up the stories, you analyze the themes, and so on, and then you move on to more interpretive research. And I have actually used psychological flexibility or self-compassion here, but you can layer them on each other. And if you want a manual of how to do it, an easy thing to follow is in the Qualitative Psychology textbook of Smith. You have Michael Murray's article, and I find it very helpful. I've used it myself. And you can actually do this not just on its own, but you can do this as a prelude to quantitative work, kind of to see what you're going to check with quantitative work, or as a way to look at details and outliers. Like you have one person who's like, wow, this person's really ruining the data set. It's like, what exactly is happening here? You can look at that using narrative research. So I actually have an example of this. I wrote an article called Understanding Self-Compassion Within a Narrative Identity. So I looked at a bunch of Japanese students. I talked about how self-criticism and self-isolation naturally reveal themselves when they're talking about their own life stories, and how they're actually embedded not just as rules, but as personas, or as particular personas that they feel they have to be. And so how self-criticism and self-isolation can get really embedded within their sense of identity. So that is one way of doing research. It did get published, and so that is one approach to looking at telling the stories of what's going on for people. Now, so there's support for this in CBS. So as I mentioned in the introduction, Yvonne Barnes Holmes' narrative, its importance in modern behavioral analysis and therapy. Our RFD at the start was mostly looking at much more basic mutual entailing, relational framing, relational networking. But with MDML, it's really starting to be able to look at higher things, like relating the relations between things, relating relational networks as a whole, and narratives are really part of this more complicated RFD relations. Yes, and so it talks about how to analyze a narrative from MDML, and then you have this special issue on narrative in behaviorism. Heinlein has a very interesting article there where he talks about how narratives work, how stories work to pull us in. Also Davis, this is in JCBS, integrating storytelling into theory and practice of CBS. RFD and how stories affect us, how it affects functional coherence, perspective taking, transforming stimulus function. Also how you can use narrative in apt conceptualization, which is what I just talked about, and looking at the process of ACT. So this is starting to gain traction in CBS. Basically all I'm doing in the previous section is saying, hey, we can do this in dialogue with existing very well established traditions of qualitative research. But this is the interesting part for me, and I think the reason why most of the research is quantitative is actually because, well, there has been quite an open critique of descriptive contextualism and descriptive research. And so McCurry, this is on the pro-quality side. Okay, so McCurry was talking about Sarben in his article. And he was saying perhaps the very goals of prediction and control are remnants of a master metaphor that have become reified and opaque from years of application. Rather, an event may be understood. That is, we can construct a coherent account of the event. This account can then be shared with and evaluated by other professionals. So, descriptive research is not trying to predict and control, it's trying to understand. And so Hayes, he concedes, he agrees with that description. Descriptive contextualists have a fairly personal purpose of analysis. They seek an appreciation of the whole by the examination of its participants. This purpose is kind of a coherence goal. So basically, what is narrative research trying to do is just trying to appreciate how, the various factors come together for this person to make this experience what it is. Now, the problem, though, is, and this is Hayes' criticism, it is difficult to assess and share the accomplishment of their goal. When have we told the story well enough? It is difficult to build a progressive science based on descriptive contextualism. So, basically, I mean, how do you evaluate good research? How well the story comes off? I mean, what use is that, right? And of course, Muto Sensei, he criticizes that qualitative research lacks reproducibility beyond the particular. That's actually a point I'm going to concede. But what I do not want to concede actually is this previous point, where that the narrative tradition is descriptive at the cost of being functional. So the point I want to say here is a narrative analysis back in, it started in 1986, and you're having this discussion in 1992, so that's not much time for it to develop. But newer forms of of narrative analysis are not merely about description. So these are actual methods that are actually getting published already in the field of narrative research. For instance, you have Langridge's critical narrative analysis. Let me read this out. Imaginative hermeneutics of suspicion are, by contrast, a way of moving beyond the simple focus on the apparent. The analyst aims to gain an alternative way of seeing, not a way that reveals the truth hidden beneath the surface, but rather a way of taking up an alternative position. So basically, he's saying here that narrative analysis is not just about what do you call this? Seeing what's on the surface, but you also have to be able to see it from alternative positions. So what would that mean? Like, for instance, you have the problem story here of being Junko trying to be a diligent student. But you don't just look at this story, but really to be able to place this story, you have to be able to see the boundaries of this story. So for instance, with the story, the Junko is picking up particular facets of her experience and highlighting those by pulling them together into a plot. Now, is she getting everything? What are the things that she chose not to highlight? So, you might call them unique outcomes. Like maybe she does have moments of creativity. It's just, they don't stick so much because they're not really embedded into herself as content. And then another thing is like, you might see that there are actually completely different sides for, alternative stories, alternative personas that are in distinction framing with the problem, So if she finds this to be a problem, maybe there's a particular vision she has for herself, which is why she's able to call this a problem. So what you see here is actually you're not just staying within the story, but you're starting to take an alternative position that requires a certain movement, a certain flexibility outside the story. And so Sarben, he says, narrative serves two functions, provides form for interpretation, and provides guides to action. So this connection to action, again, this comes from pragmatism, is very, very important because it connects this idea of functional. So Michael White, he's on the narrative practice side, but later on I'll bring it back to analysis. He says he would ask, what effects does this story, this way of making sense of events, have on your life? How do you feel about that? So when you have this story of being a good student, what does that do in your life? And how do you feel about the kind of effect that has? And so what you see here it's not just a form, looking at the form of the story, but looking at the function of the story in relation to life. And also, you see here a connection toward values, right? And the attitude, the evaluative posture you take toward the stories. So, narrative therapy will actually focus on how to ask beyond the problem story, unique outcomes, values, alternative stories. They have a very interesting way of doing this. I was trained in that. But what's basically happening here, even if you're asking this in not in therapy, but just in a process of interviewing, you're already strengthening diffusion and self as context. When you're asking, hey, how do these stories function? Hey, how do you feel about that? You're already creating this distance to the self that transcends the story by looking at function, limits, and alternatives. So for instance, if you look at Junko's story, of course, she has the problem story on the bottom. But if you look, at the positive side of it, if you look at the edges of that, what lies outside of that story, you might see that actually she has stories about research. She has where she's actually able to do her research. She might have times when she's feeling uncertain and excited, and she maybe, by opening up to that more and noticing that more, she's able to catch more how she's able to move with that. She has what do you call this? She starts to see the effect of being a good student on how she behaves, seeing moments that she'd actually be able to be critical. Why did she even choose to be a researcher? Or when she says, I'm not happy with just being a good student, where is that coming from? What is her value of research? So you're just, you're not necessarily doing therapy here. You're just asking, okay, what makes this problem story a problem story? Or where are you distinction framing it from? How are you evaluating it? And that's already creating a different line, an alternative story. And very important, this is not just, narrative therapy. As I said, qualitative research is actually moving more toward function. So you have languages CNA I mentioned above. Williams, Lamont, O'Brien have an article on how, narrative research is actually part of change and creating change in social action. CDA, FDA are also very closely connected to this idea of making a difference. So this is part of the influence of what they call social constructionism. Let me read this out. Many social constructionist researchers believe that the aims of research should not become the discovery of mere facts, but the mobilization of the research process toward a different goal, a pragmatic and political one. For any usefulness that the researcher's reading of a phenomenon might have in bringing change for those who need it. And so what you see here, this is very different. This is not descriptive versus functional, but now narrative is not just about understanding in a descriptive sense, but about prediction and influence aided by understanding. So there's understanding, obviously, that you're trying to understand the coherence of narrative as it's found not just in content but in the structure, understanding how to break a story apart. But there's also prediction, so understanding the problem, understanding how it repeats. If I know the problem story, I'm better able to catch, and I'm also better able to help my client catch when the problem arises, if it's a recurring problem. And then also, this also creates influence. So one is being able to notice when it happens. It's actually influential in itself, but by understanding stories as stories, kind of taking you get some distance from it. Self as author, context. From self as content, you're able to clarify your values. You're able to find content to support your values. So Yvonne Barnes-Holmes will say one of the key roles of modern human behavior therapy is to help the client to understand as a human being how their narrative pertaining to their life history either facilitates or hinders living a full and rich life. And this is actually what narrative analysis is already trying to do. So this goes beyond the dualism of, are you observing or are you intervening? In a sense, when it comes to people, observation does intervene. And in this case, it intervenes so much that it's almost impossible to tell the two apart. So, sample research again, just to show how this might be done. First is, very important, clear research goals. As Stephen Hayes says, you have to have clear research goals or it becomes dogmatic. So, functional descriptive research question: how can we understand the participant's problem story in a way that empowers them to recognize their problem and expand their behavioral repertoire beyond it? So you have a functional and descriptive goal. And it's a small sample size. I'm guessing one is probably the best. I'm working on one now. and multi-part interviews. So you would have to describe the problem story, like Junko as diligent, uncreative student, do structural analysis on that, similar to descriptive approach. But then here's where it changes. You start to ask about the function of the problem story. So, what does it do? In Junko's case, it tends to avoid uncertainty about research, tends to block her values. And then you start to look at the limits of the problem story. What lies outside of that? Values, unique outcomes, alternative stories. And then lastly, also looking at the effects of the interview on this person. So one of the things I did is I did the MPFI before and after, and I am finding improvements in the MPFI scores after this process of interviewing. So is there a manual for this method? Not yet, but I think it's actually very close to Langridge's CNA, and so I'm drawing on that, and I'm working on a paper on this right now. Now, there's some other advantages that I thought I'd mention. First is it clarifies the I-thou relation in therapy. So narrative is not an individual actor model, but it's a relational dialogical model. Storytelling always presumes a listener. Self always presumes an other. And this is the core point of Sarbin and George Herbert Mead. And so when you're looking at data, you're not just looking at the client in isolation, but you are part of that interaction. This client is interacting with you. So this is very important in qualitative research. It's called reflexivity. And then another thing that comes up for those of you who do FAP, CRBs, clinically relevant behaviors. In other words, if someone's trying to be a good student, she's not just going to tell me about it. She's going to act that way toward me. And that's going to be, in a sense, part of the data because it's interactional. Okay, and so it clarifies the I-thou relationship in therapy, and then second is it links directly to prosocial. So Murray says the narrator is an active agent who is part of a social world. We can also consider group, community, or societal narratives. So Junko's problem is embedded in this whole social discourse of the Kitai Sarugakse, what kind of student Japan expects, the good student, right? And that means overcoming it will also connect to the need for social change that supports her values. So you really see here the link from individual act to pro-social change, which is something I think is very interesting and very promising. Okay, so that's it. Let me read out my conclusion. Number one, qualitative psychology, particularly narrative analysis, entered the dialogue with CBS as descriptive contextualism. We can use it to understand the initial stories of the client, the story of the therapy process, and its results. And number two, in the approach of narrative psychology, one analyzes the structure of stories, themes, and personas to highlight particular experience and its variations rather than generalizability. Number three, this has links to CBS, but that can now analyze stories via RFD and see their therapeutic effect. But there remains a criticism that narrative analysis is descriptive, not functional. However, newer forms of narrative analysis do not merely describe stories, but see its boundaries, unique outcomes, alternative stories, and their effects on action and how those effects are evaluated. And so number four, this allows narrative analysis to be functional descriptive, where understanding and prediction and influence are combined. By understanding narratives, one can predict how a problem recurs and influence one's ability to go beyond it. This can also connect to more relational understanding of CBS, as is required by prosocial. Okay, so that's it for my talk, and after this we're going to have also the talk of Fumiya and what do you call this? And Teruhiko. And yeah, but it's not going to be in this video, so this is just a bit of a taste of how our talk is going to go. Thank you very much.